September 1938. A daughter is born into the inner circle of the Third Reich. Her name is Edda Göring. Her father is Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. The cradle was made of silver and silk. While Europe prepared for war, Edda lived in a palace called Carinhall. It was a fortress of stolen art and golden statues. To the public, she was the little princess of the regime. Thousands of letters arrived from German citizens, treating her birth like a national holiday. But this luxury had a price. Every toy and every dress was funded by the systematic plunder of occupied territories. The violence was invisible to her. She saw her father as a hero, not a war criminal. He wore medals and expensive furs. He hosted banquets while the state planned the destruction of millions. For Edda, the Third Reich was not a regime. It was her playground. May 1945. The empire collapsed. The sound of American tanks replaced the music of the palace. Overnight, the luxury vanished. The carpets were rolled up, the gold was seized, and the servants fled. Edda and her mother were arrested by the Allies. They went from a palace to a cold, damp cell in an internment camp. Why did the world watch her so closely? She was only a child. But the name Göring carried a weight no one could ignore. People wanted to see if the daughter of a monster would become one herself. Hermann Göring committed suicide in his cell using a cyanide pill. He left his daughter a legacy of blood and shame. The trial at Nuremberg labeled him a mass murderer. But Edda did not denounce him. In the footage from the post-war years, her face remained stoic. She kept his photos. She maintained his memory. She lived in a small apartment in Munich. The contrast was total. No more palaces, no more servants, only a life of quiet isolation. She worked as a lab technician, hiding her identity from colleagues. At first glance, she was a victim of her father's crimes. But in reality, she remained a loyalist until the end. She never apologized for his actions. She claimed he was a loving father, ignoring the evidence of his atrocities. She spent decades fighting the German government in court to reclaim the stolen art from her father's estate. She wanted the gold back. How did the public react? Some felt pity for a woman trapped by history. Others saw her as a silent symbol of unrepentant Nazism. She lived in the shadows for 80 years. She died in 2018. There was no public funeral, no monument. The city of Munich buried her in an unmarked grave to prevent it from becoming a shrine. The story ends in silence. June 2nd, 1938. This was the date the First Lady of the Third Reich was born. Hermann Göring was at the peak of his influence. He didn't just hold power. He owned the Luftwaffe, presided over the Reichstag, and stood as the official successor to Adolf Hitler. If the Führer fell, Göring was the next in line. He lived in a world of stolen art, gold-trimmed uniforms, and massive estates. Why did the public adore her? The Nazi propaganda machine needed a symbol of the perfect family. Edda Göring became that symbol. The footage from the era shows the scale of her life. Carinhall, the family estate, was a palace built on 60,000 acres of forest. Inside, the walls were covered with looted masterpieces from across Europe. The sound of champagne corks and military marches defined her early years. For Edda, this wasn't a regime, it was home. But the reality was far from a fairy tale. While Edda played in a miniature palace built just for her, her father signed orders for the destruction of cities and the systematic looting of nations. He was the architect of the Gestapo. He was a man who traded human lives for luxury. Edda saw none of this. She saw a father who brought her jewels and silk. Events accelerated quickly. By 1945, the walls of Carinhall were no longer safe. The Soviet army was advancing from the east. The Americans were closing in from the west. The luxury evaporated in weeks. In the frame, the once mighty Göring is stripped of his medals. He becomes a prisoner in a plain cell at Nuremberg. The gold is gone. The art is confiscated. Edda and her mother, Emmy, are moved from a palace to a cramped cottage. How did she survive the aftermath? She went from a princess of the Reich to a social pariah overnight. For the next 70 years, she lived in a quiet, persistent denial. She never denounced her father. She kept his photos on her walls. She defended his memory until her final breath in 2018. There was no turning back for the girl born into the heart of the Nazi elite. The weight of the Göring name remained her only inheritance. The fall was absolute. Carinhall, a massive, extravagant estate belonging to Hermann Göring. The residence functioned as one part palace, one part museum for stolen art, and one part temple dedicated to the Marshal's ego. It was a monumental construction deep within the Schorfheid forest. The interior featured endless corridors, heavy sculptures, and stuffed animals. Banquet halls were filled with art collections, stripped from persecuted Jews and families destroyed by the regime. But for Edda, none of this felt dark. It was simply home. The girl had a fleet of nannies, private tutors, and servants. Her routine mirrored that of a princess. Visitors included high-ranking SS officers, Nazi ministers, and foreign leaders. Even Adolf Hitler visited the estate. Hitler showed affection for the child and called her Mein kleines Mädel, or my little girl. Everything in her childhood followed a specific script. Her life projected the image of an elite Nazi family, strong, healthy, Aryan, disciplined. But behind the grandeur sat a bubble of lies. The year was 1944. The glory days were ending. The Luftwaffe had failed to defend German soil. High-ranking Nazi leaders now viewed Hermann Göring as incompetent. Hitler himself had lost all confidence in his longtime friend. The Red Army continued its steady advance from the east. Göring made a desperate choice. He ordered the destruction of Carinhall. He would not allow the Soviets to capture his beloved mansion. Edda was only 7 years old. She watched as her world collapsed. Her dolls, her animals, and the giant hallways were obliterated. Explosives turned the stone and timber into rubble. It was a brutal sight for a child. The footage shows the aftermath, smoking ruins where a palace once stood. What happened next? The girl and her mother, Emmy Göring, began a frantic escape. They moved through a shattered Germany. They avoided Soviet patrols and searched for American troops. There was no turning back. The world they knew was gone. May 1945. The war in Europe ended, and with it, the reign of Jürgen Göring. Allied forces tracked him down and took him into custody. The luxury of the palace was replaced by a prison cell. Edda and her mother did not escape. Military police placed them under strict supervision. Every asset was seized. The cars, the art, and the estates were gone. The Nuremberg trials began. Edda was allowed to visit her father several times behind bars. She walked through cold corridors to see a man the world called a monster. These meetings stayed with her until her final breath. People close to the family noted her reaction. She did not see a war criminal. She saw a father. She described these moments as pure love, completely detached from the screams of the battlefield. But the war did not allow for such separations. October 15th, 1946. The execution was scheduled for the next morning. Edda was only 8 years old when the news arrived. Her father had cheated the gallows. He crushed a glass cyanide capsule between his teeth and died in his cell. The golden childhood was over. It didn't just fade, it shattered. The aftermath was a life among the ruins. The authorities released Edda and Emmy, but they were not free. Post-war Germany was a landscape of hunger and rubble. To carry the name Göring was to carry a target. Public sentiment had turned to rage. Every door stayed locked. How did they survive? They had no money and no property. They relied on secret networks. Old loyalists and former officials sent small donations in the mail. These were the people who still clung to the shadow of the Marshal. Edda grew up in a country that officially hated her father, but secretly housed pockets of resentment and extremism. The contrast was absolute. One year, she lived like royalty. The next, she stood in bread lines. There were no more silk dresses. There was only the reality of a destroyed nation. She learned to hide her name. She learned to live in the silence of the defeated. The era of the palaces had ended. The era of survival began. Silence and collective guilt defined her world. Post-war Germany carried a heavy historical shame. For Edda, adolescence meant public humiliation and hidden discrimination. Financial struggles were constant. Social surveillance followed her everywhere. She rarely spoke about her personal life. On official documents, she occasionally omitted the surname Göring. but she never legally changed it. At school, her identity caused two reactions. Some students showed morbid curiosity. Others moved away completely. Edda responded with a specific strategy. She built a reputation for being polite, studious, and quiet. She graduated and completed vocational training in administration. A professional life began. But history did not let go. Adult life brought modest employment. She worked primarily in clinics and hospitals across Bavaria. For years, she lived in a peaceful and reserved manner. Then, the peace would break. The name Göring would reappear in the newspapers. Her name followed immediately after. This happened for one reason. Edda refused to publicly condemn her father. Other children of high-ranking Nazis chose a different path. They rejected their inheritance and became activists against extremism. Edda did the opposite. Why did she stay silent? At first glance, loyalty. But in reality, a deep refusal to separate the man from the monster. She maintained an unwavering defense of her father. "He was a good man to me," she often said. This was her primary argument. Edda never explicitly denied the crimes of the Third Reich. However, she never accepted the demonized image of Hermann Göring. She viewed him through the lens of a daughter, not a historian. The footage from this era shows a woman living in small apartments. The camera records her walking quickly through Munich streets to avoid reporters. In the frame, stacks of legal documents and old family photographs. She spent decades fighting the German government in court. She wanted her father's confiscated art collection back. She wanted the state to pay for what they took. The legal battles failed. The public remained hostile. She stayed in her small Munich flat until the end. The story cut off here. Two different men. That was how Edda Göring viewed her father. In her mind, she separated the war criminal from the parent who held her in his arms. Psychologists call this compartmentalization. For Edda, it was a survival mechanism. She refused to acknowledge the blood on Hermann Göring's hands. She only remembered the smiles. This distorted perspective dictated every decision she made for the next 70 years. 1961. West Germany faced a public relations nightmare. Edda Göring filed a claim for a state pension. Under old laws that remained on the books, she was entitled to government funds because her father had held high-ranking official positions. The public was outraged. Protesters took to the streets. Headlines screamed the same question: why should the victims of the Holocaust pay for the lifestyle of a Nazi's daughter? The legal battle lasted for years. Inside the courtroom, lawyers argued over inheritance and bloodlines. Some citizens defended her, claiming a child is not responsible for the sins of the father. Others saw the pension as an insult to the dead. The court eventually reached a verdict. Edda won a portion of the pension. She received monthly payments from the state until her death in 2018. But money was only the beginning. The real conflict involved something much more valuable: the battle for stolen art. This remains the most controversial chapter of her life. During the war, Hermann Göring had built one of the largest private art collections in Europe. He didn't buy these pieces. He took them. He looted galleries and stripped Jewish families of their heritage. One painting stood at the center of the storm: The Madonna and Child by Lucas Cranach the Elder. The footage from the archives is clear. The painting was a gift for Edda's baptism in 1938, but the gift was stolen. The city of Cologne had been forced to donate it under pressure from the Nazi regime. Decades later, Edda wanted it back. She sued the city. She didn't see a stolen relic. She saw a childhood memento. The legal documents show a cold reality. Edda Göring fought for 15 years to reclaim Nazi loot. She sat in courtrooms with a stoic expression. No apologies, no regret. She viewed the stolen masterpieces as her rightful inheritance. She ignored the provenance of the frames. She ignored the history of the seizures. For Edda, the law was a tool to reclaim a lost empire. The court reached its final decision. The city of Cologne kept the painting. Edda Göring left the courthouse empty-handed. It was a rare defeat for the woman who spent a lifetime defending a monster. The legal files were closed, but the moral debate never ended. The story of the stolen art ended in a stalemate. 4,000 pieces of art. That was the scale of the private collection belonging to Hermann Göring. He was not just the commander of the Luftwaffe. He was one of the most prolific art looters in modern history. He systematically stripped Europe of its cultural heritage to fill his own hallways. Why did he steal so much? At first glance, a passion for beauty, but in reality, a calculated display of absolute power. The collection included Renaissance paintings, Baroque masterpieces, and Impressionist canvases. He seized rare sculptures, ancient tapestries, and gold jewelry. He targeted entire estates owned by persecuted Jewish families. Specialized Nazi units like the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg did the dirty work. They moved through occupied territories, identified high-value targets, and loaded crates onto trains. Göring viewed these items as trophies. He displayed the stolen treasures at Carinhall, his massive country estate. The footage shows him walking through rooms filled with stolen history. He often invited Hitler to view the latest acquisitions. He boasted about the pieces as if they were symbols of his personal dominance within the Reich. 1945. The regime collapsed. Allied forces moved across Germany and discovered massive depots of hidden art. Carinhall was a warehouse of crime. The inventory was staggering. There were works from French museums, Dutch galleries, and private Belgian collections. Most were assets confiscated from Jewish owners after their deportation or murder. The scale of the theft was industrial. Thousands of paintings sat in crates, representing thousands of destroyed lives. The sound of Allied trucks hauling away the loot signaled the end of the plunder. This was the environment where Edda Göring grew up. The legal and moral battle for this blood-stained inheritance was about to begin. It got worse. The story cut off here.